Picture this. It's dawn in London, 1640. The sun rises over a city that stinks, literally reeks of human waste, animal dung, and death. The smell hasn't changed in decades. It never will. You wake up in a cramped room you share with your entire family. The mattress beneath you is filled with straw that hasn't been changed in months. Fleas crawl across your skin. Lice nest in your hair. You scratch until you bleed. But it doesn't matter, they'll be back tonight, and the night after that, and the night after that. Your name doesn't matter. Your hopes don't matter. Your dreams? Forget them. You are a woman in 1640s London, and your only job is to survive another day. This is not a romantic story. This is the truth that history forgot to tell you. London in 1640 was one of the fastest growing cities in all of Europe. People flooded in from the countryside, desperate, hoping for work, hoping for a chance at a better life. But what they found instead was something much darker. The city was suffocating under its own weight. Houses were built on top of houses, crammed so tightly together that you could barely see the sky from the street. The rich lived on one side of town, clean, spacious, with gardens and light. The poor, they lived in what we can only describe as human storage units. Let me paint a picture of where you, as a poor woman in 1640, would likely have lived. Your home was probably a single room, perhaps 12 feet by 15 feet at most. This room was your family's kitchen, bedroom, living area, and toilet combined. Your husband worked as a laborer or a craftsman. Your children, if you had any who survived infancy, shared the space with you. Maybe there was a fireplace in the corner, but it gave off more smoke than warmth. In winter, you stayed cold. In summer, the heat was suffocating. Water came from a well that was shared with dozens of families. The well was usually polluted. You didn't know that yet, the germ theory hadn't been invented, but you knew that people who drank too much of the water got sick. So you learned to boil it with whatever herbs you could afford. This had the double benefit of making it taste slightly less like death, and it actually killed some of the bacteria, though you had no idea why it worked. Sanitation? There was none. No toilets, no sewers, no waste management system. People threw their bodily waste out the window into the streets. Pigs roamed freely, eating garbage and human feces. Rats were so numerous that they had practically become a permanent part of the population. And the smell, God, the smell. Historians would write about it centuries later, but they would never adequately capture it. It was the smell of 1,000 bodies living on top of each other, never bathing, never changing their clothes, never washing anything. It was the smell of rotting food, animal waste, human waste, and disease. It was a smell that embedded itself in your clothes, your hair, your skin. You never got clean because clean wasn't possible. The worst part? You accepted it. This was normal. This was life. This was the only life you would ever know. In this world of filth and overcrowding, disease spread like fire. The plague that ancient horror would return in 1665, just 25 years after our 1640 date, and it would kill approximately 100,000 people. That's about a quarter of London's entire population, dead in 18 months. But even before that, disease was constant. Smallpox, consumption, typhus, dysentery, these weren't rare occurrences. They were fixtures of everyday life. Imagine living with the constant knowledge that a cough might be the beginning of the end, that a fever could be fatal, that the water you drank might be the thing that kills you. For women, though, there was an even more terrifying enemy: childbirth. If you were a woman living in 1640s London, and if you were married, which most of you would have been, because that was the only acceptable path for a woman, then at some point you would become pregnant. And that pregnancy, that was a death sentence waiting to happen. In 16th and 17th century England, the statistics were absolutely brutal. 1 out of every 40 women died in childbirth. Think about that. If you were in a room with 40 women your age, one of you would not survive the experience of having a baby. And the children? As many as 200 out of 1,000 children, that's 1 in 5, would die before the age of 5. By the end of the 17th century, infant mortality in London had reached 334 to 360 per 1,000 births. More than a third of all babies born alive died before they even started school. The process began with the pregnancy itself, and it was terrifying in a way that's hard for us to comprehend today. There were no prenatal tests, no ultrasounds, no way to know if anything was wrong until the moment of birth. Women spent 9 months wondering, will I survive this? Will my baby be born alive? Will it be healthy? Or will I die and leave my children motherless? The fear was so real, so present, that it became ritual. If you were a wealthy woman, you would make your will before you went into labor. You would make your confession to a priest, asking for God's forgiveness, the way people do when they're facing death. Because that's what it was, you were facing death. The only question was whether you would come out the other side. When the time came to give birth, you would be attended by midwives, usually older women in the community who had experience with childbirth. In some cases, they were good at what they did. In many cases, they were not. There was no formal training, no standards, no way to hold them accountable if something went wrong. The birth itself would take place in a room with your female friends and relatives. Men were not allowed. Childbirth was a women's world. But that didn't mean it was a safe world or a comfortable one. The room would be cold or boiling hot depending on the season. There would be no pain relief, nothing. You would simply have to endure. And if something went wrong during the birth, if the baby was positioned wrong, if there was too much bleeding, if the placenta didn't come out properly, there was almost nothing anyone could do. In the modern world, these are the situations where we send women to the hospital, where doctors perform cesarean sections, where transfusions save lives. In 1640, there was no hospital, no doctor, and if you started bleeding internally, you were going to die. Some women hemorrhaged to death on the birthing bed, their bodies unable to handle the trauma of childbirth. Some got infections, puerperal fever, we call it now, though the connection between the unwashed hands of midwives and the infections wasn't understood yet. You'd survive the birth, feeling relieved and exhausted, only to start burning with fever 3 days later. By the time they realized you were dying, it was too late. And there was the emotional component. Remember, you probably didn't want this baby. It wasn't that you didn't love children. Children were an essential part of society, the way forward, the means of ensuring your family's survival. But you also knew, intellectually and viscerally, that having this baby might kill you, and whether it killed you or not, it would make you poorer. You would have another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, at a time when you were already struggling to survive. The grief, though the grief was real. Maybe you gave birth to a stillborn child, or maybe your baby died days later. There was a custom in England. If one child died, you would name the next child of the same sex with the exact same name. It's a small act, but it speaks volumes. It says, "I loved you so much that I refused to let your name die." Even in a world where death was common, where losing children was almost expected, the grief remained. It didn't get easier, it didn't get less painful, it just became normal. And you would do it again. You would have baby after baby, knowing each time that this might be the one that kills you. Why? Because that was your role. That was your purpose. Your husband needed heirs, your family needed workers, society needed children, and your needs, your terror, your survival, those were secondary concerns at best. Here's something that might seem unbelievable to you if you're watching this from the 21st century. As a married woman in 1640, you did not legally exist. This wasn't hyperbole. This was the actual law of the land. It was called Coverture, and it was perhaps the most dehumanizing legal doctrine ever created. Here's how it worked. When you married, your identity, your legal identity, your property rights, your ability to sign contracts, your ability to sue or be sued independently, all of it merged with your husband's. You became what was called a femme covert, which literally means a covered woman. Your legal existence was covered, hidden, absorbed into your husband's. An unmarried woman, by contrast, was a femme sole, a sole woman, and she had significant rights. She could own property, run a business, sign contracts, and generally control her own life. But the moment she married, all of that disappeared. Your husband now owned everything you brought into the marriage. Your dowry, his. Your clothes, his. The money you might have inherited from your father, his. If you had a skill, maybe you were trained as a dressmaker or a cook, you couldn't work without his permission, and any money you made belonged to him. And if you were thinking about running away, that wasn't an option either. You belonged to your husband. You were his property, legally speaking. He could force you to return home, and the law would support him. But it got worse, much worse. Your husband had the legal right to physically discipline you. In other words, he could beat you. This wasn't considered abuse, it was considered correction. The law even had a term for it, chastisement. Your husband had a legal right to chastise you, meaning he had a legal right to hit you. Now, there were limits, technically. The beating wasn't supposed to be excessive. But what did excessive mean? How much beating was too much? The law didn't specify. And in practice, the courts were remarkably reluctant to intervene. A man would have to beat his wife very, very severely before the law would step in. We're talking about cases where women had bones broken, where they were nearly beaten to death. If you were being abused, your options were limited. You could try to leave, but where would you go? You had no money of your own, no property of your own. You couldn't take your children, they belonged to your husband. You couldn't take your clothes beyond what you were wearing. And even if you managed to escape, you could be forced to return to him by the courts. There was a brutal legal process. If you could prove the abuse, if you could show torn clothing and bruises, then you might be able to get a legal separation. But even then, you wouldn't get a divorce. You wouldn't be free to remarry. You would just be separated from your husband, unable to remarry, basically condemned to a life of solitude and poverty. Some women, faced with unbearable situations, killed themselves, and even that act was criminalized. A woman who committed suicide was considered to have committed a felony, to have murdered herself. Her body would be treated with dishonor, sometimes even denied a Christian burial. Her property would be forfeited to the crown. Her children would become wards of the state. So even death was not an escape. Now, it's worth noting that some marriages were probably okay. Some husbands were probably decent men who didn't beat their wives or treat them with contempt. We have letters and diaries that suggest mutual affection existed between some married couples. And the poorer you were, the more likely it was that your marriage was based on genuine feeling rather than property calculations because you had no property to protect. But the important thing is this: whether your marriage was good or bad, whether your husband was kind or cruel, you had no legal protection. You had no recourse. You had no choice. You simply had to hope that the man you married turned out to be a decent human being. And if he wasn't, there was almost nothing you could do about it. This was not unique to women. Servants experienced similar restrictions. Children experienced similar restrictions. But for women, especially married women, this legal non-existence was total and complete. It's worth thinking about what this meant on a psychological level. You grew up knowing that your entire future depended on finding a man who wouldn't treat you too badly. You learned to be compliant, to be quiet, to make yourself small. You learned to anticipate your husband's needs before he even expressed them. You learned to accept violence as a normal part of married life, or at least to not expect it to be prevented. And you accepted it all, because this was the system, this was the law, this was God's will, or so the priests told you. So what did you actually do, day in and day out? As a woman living in 1640s London? Work. You worked constantly. Your day probably started before dawn. In winter, you would wake in darkness. In summer, the sun would already be starting to lighten the sky. The first thing you did was get the fire started if there was a fire because you needed to cook breakfast, which was usually a thin, grain-based porridge called pottage, or if you were lucky, some bread. Bread was expensive. If your family was poor, you would buy cheap bread made from barley or rye, coarse and heavy, and not very nutritious, but filling. If you were slightly better off, you might afford wheat bread occasionally. But bread made from wheat, the kind the rich people ate, was reserved for the wealthy. For you, bread was a luxury item. Your family's diet consisted mostly of cheap vegetables if you could afford them, or legumes, beans, lentils, peas. These were boiled into pottage with water and whatever herbs or spices you could get your hands on. If your family was very poor, you might go days eating nothing but bread and weak beer. Yes, beer. Even children drank beer in this period because water was so unsafe to drink. Beer was a food. Basically, it provided calories and had fewer germs than water. After breakfast, the real work began. You had to maintain the household. This meant fetching water from the well, and I mean carrying heavy buckets of water multiple times a day, sometimes from several blocks away if the nearest well had run dry. You had to wash clothes, which meant boiling water, soaking the fabric, scrubbing it by hand, rinsing it repeatedly, and then hanging it to dry. In winter, this was agonizing. Your hands would crack and bleed from the cold water. In summer, you would be exhausted from standing in the heat over a fire. You had to cook, which involved an actual fire, not a modern stove. You had to carefully manage the heat, make sure the food didn't burn, stir constantly, and you had to do all of this while managing children, while your hands were chapped and bleeding, while sweat was dripping down your face, while you were probably pregnant or nursing or dealing with some gynecological issue that you couldn't talk to anyone about and certainly couldn't get treated for. You had to clean. This meant sweeping, scrubbing surfaces with whatever cloth you had available, disposing of waste. The waste disposal probably meant throwing it out the window into the street, contributing to the general filth of London. You had to maintain your family's clothing and bedding, which meant mending, patching, sewing. Nothing was discarded. If something ripped, you fixed it. If it ripped again, you patched it. Eventually the patches had patches, but you kept going. You had to make or acquire thread, needles, whatever materials you needed. If you had children, you had to care for them while doing all of this other work. Toddlers would be strapped to your back in a cloth while you worked, their weight pulling on your shoulders and back. Older children would be watched while you worked, and they would probably be put to work as well, doing simple tasks, learning the skills they would need as adults. If you were lucky enough to have a skill, if you knew how to make lace, for instance, or how to sew particular kinds of garments you might take in work from wealthier households. This would earn you some extra money, but it also meant you were working even longer hours. You'd be doing your household work, and then you'd be doing this skilled work as well, often by candlelight late into the night. You had to maintain some knowledge of basic medicine and herbs. This wasn't optional. If someone in your family got sick, it was your job to try to heal them. You would have knowledge of which herbs helped with which illnesses, how to make poultices and decoctions, how to bind wounds, how to deliver babies. If someone died and people died constantly, you would be involved in preparing the body for burial. And underlying all of this was hunger. Constant, gnawing hunger. Even if you weren't starving, even if your family had enough to eat most days, there was always the knowledge that food was precious, that it could run out, that a bad harvest or a disruption in trade could mean suffering. This was exacerbated by the English Civil War, which was happening right during this period. The Civil War, which lasted from 1642 to 1651, disrupted trade, caused inflation, and brought soldiers through the countryside who would plunder food supplies. Imagine being a woman during this time and having soldiers come through your area, requisitioning food that your family needed to survive. Imagine the fear, the desperation, the helplessness. And after all of this work, after fetching water, cooking, cleaning, mending, caring for children, maybe working for extra money, you would collapse into bed, probably not having eaten much yourself, having made sure your family ate first. You would fall asleep in the dark, in a room that smelled like human bodies and waste and smoke, and you would know that tomorrow would be exactly the same. This was not a life. This was survival. Let me tell you about a woman who lived in 1640s London. Her name was forgotten within a generation, as were most women's names, but her life, or lives like hers, were recorded in the sparse records that survived. She married young, probably in her late teens or early 20s. She had no choice in the matter. Her father arranged it, and she accepted it because that's what women did. Her husband was probably someone of similar social status, a laborer, a craftsman, a shopkeeper. They probably had some affection for each other, which was fortunate, because they were going to spend the rest of their lives together in a tiny room, having babies, and struggling to survive. She had her first child when she was probably around 20 years old. She survived the birth, which was good, many women didn't. But the baby might not have survived. Infant mortality was so high that having a newborn was not a cause for pure celebration. It was a period of intense anxiety. You didn't name the baby right away sometimes, because the child might not survive long enough to be named. She had another child perhaps a year or two later, and another, and another. Some of her children would die. Maybe one would die of a fever, another of dysentery, another would simply fail to thrive. This was normal. Everybody lost children. But she would also lose pregnancies. She might miscarry. She might give birth to a stillborn child. And each time, she would have to recover physically and emotionally and get back to work, because there was no stopping, no time for grief. If she was lucky, she might have 3 or 4 children who survived to adulthood. If she was very lucky, maybe 5 or 6. But she probably had 10 or 12 pregnancies, because that's what the statistics tell us. She would spend much of her adult life either pregnant or nursing or recovering from childbirth. And that's if she survived. If she was unlucky, she would die in childbirth or from complications afterward. Her husband would remarry. He needed someone to take care of his household and his remaining children. Her children would be cared for by a stepmother, who might be kind to them or might not be. What would be remembered about this woman? Probably nothing. Maybe her name would appear in a church record. Maybe she would be listed in her husband's will, usually with a small bequest, maybe a piece of jewelry, maybe some money. If she had given birth during a particularly important time, she might be mentioned in a letter. But her internal world, her hopes, her fears, her dreams, all of that would be gone within a few generations. This is what it meant to be a woman in 1640s London. Your role was clear. Marry, have children, maintain the household, and die, leaving behind the next generation to do the same. But here's something that's important to understand. Women of this era were not passive victims. They were not helpless or weak. Within the constraints of an oppressive system, they found ways to exercise agency and power. If you had any education, which was unusual for poor women, but possible if you were from a slightly better off family, you might have been able to read. Reading, especially reading the Bible, was seen as acceptable for women. It was a way of understanding God's will. Some women used their literacy to connect with other women, to share knowledge, to resist in subtle ways. If you had any skill, you would use it to improve your family's situation. You might take in work, as mentioned before. You might sell goods at the market. You might use your knowledge of healing to help other women in the community, which gave you status and a bit of independence. If you were a midwife, and some women became midwives, you had a position of power and respect. You were called into homes at the moment of crisis, and you had specialized knowledge. You were paid for your work. You had some economic independence. This was rare, but it was possible. And there was community. Women supported each other. They shared knowledge about managing pregnancies, caring for children, healing illnesses. They attended each other's births. They mourned each other's losses. This informal network of female support was one of the most important aspects of women's lives, even if it's not recorded in any official documents. Wealthier women, the wives of merchants or minor nobility, had more options. They could own property in some cases. They could participate in the intellectual life of their time. Some of them were compiling recipe books, which were not just recipes but also records of medical knowledge and household management. These books were written down and preserved, and they represent a form of women's knowledge and authority, even if the woman's name was often not on the title page. But for the vast majority of women, the poor women, the working class women, life was constrained, dangerous, exhausting, and short. Society had very clear expectations for women in 1640. These expectations were reinforced by the church, by the law, by culture, by family, by every institution that had any power. A good woman was obedient. She obeyed her father, then her husband, then her sons. She did not speak out of turn. She did not voice opinions that contradicted men. She accepted her role as secondary, as support, as a vessel for men's desires and needs. A good woman was sexually virtuous. If she was unmarried, she was a virgin. There was no question about this. If she was not a virgin, she was worthless, literally, from a marriage market perspective. Her value as a potential wife was determined by her chastity. If she was married, she was faithful to her husband. She did not pursue her own sexual desires. She was there to satisfy her husband when he wanted her and to bear children. A good woman was pious. She attended church. She believed in God and accepted the teachings of the church, which told her that her suffering was noble, that her subservience was ordained by God, that her pain in childbirth was her punishment for Eve's original sin. She did not question these teachings. A good woman was domestic. Her sphere was the household. She did not work in the public sphere, did not participate in politics or commerce at any high level. Her expertise was in cooking, cleaning, sewing, gardening, and household management. A good woman was nurturing. She cared for her children and her husband. She did not pursue her own interests. Her satisfaction came from her family's well-being. If you were not a good woman by these standards, you were subjected to intense social pressure. Your community would know about your failings. They would gossip about you. They would isolate you. If your behavior was bad enough, you could be branded a witch, or accused of sexual immorality, or worse. And yet, despite all of these constraints, women of this era found ways to live, to connect, to create meaning. They did not simply accept the role that society had given them. They found small rebellions, small moments of autonomy, small ways of exercising power. Some women ran businesses, even if it was technically illegal for a married woman to do so. Some women participated in religious debate and learning, even though it was considered inappropriate. Some women had affairs, or chose not to have children if they could manage it, or found other ways to resist, but these were exceptions. For most women, resistance was not possible. And that's the tragedy of this story. That's what we need to understand. That's what history usually forgets to tell us. There are no names. That's what strikes you when you research this period. There are statistics: 1 in 40 women died in childbirth. 201,000 children died before age 5. The infant mortality rate in London was 334 to 360 per thousand. These are important statistics. They tell us about the scale of suffering, but they don't tell us about individual women. There are occasional records: a diary kept by a wealthy woman, a letter written by a merchant's wife to a friend, a will that mentions a wife by name, a church record that lists a burial. But the vast majority of women left no trace at all. They lived and died and were forgotten. We don't know what they thought about. We don't know if they were happy or miserable. We don't know if they loved their husbands or despised them. We don't know if they wanted their babies or resented them. We don't know their dreams, because they probably never had the luxury of dreams. They were too busy surviving. But we can imagine. We can understand the constraints they lived under, the dangers they faced, the lack of choice they had. We can recognize that their lives were real and important, even if they were never recorded. What would a woman from 1640s say if she could speak to us now? What would she want us to know? I think she would want us to know that she was strong. Despite everything, despite the constant threat of death, despite the legal non-existence, despite the pain and the fear and the hunger, she kept going. She got up every morning and did the work that needed to be done. She cared for her children. She maintained her household. She supported her community. She was resilient. She would want us to know that she was not inferior to men, even though the law said she was, even though society said she was. She had knowledge, skills, courage, and intelligence. She made decisions that affected her family and her community. She mattered. And she would want us to know that she was human. She felt things. She loved and grieved and feared and hoped. She was not a historical statistic. She was a person. When we think about history, we usually think about wars and kings, about political movements and economic systems. But history is also made up of countless individual lives, lived out in small rooms in crowded cities, in the everyday struggle to survive and maintain some dignity and meaning. The women of 1640s London were not recorded in the history books. Their names are forgotten, their stories are lost, but they mattered. They shaped the world that came after them. Their daughters became the next generation of women, and their daughters after that, carrying forward resilience and strength through centuries of constraint and difficulty, until eventually, the legal systems began to change, and women began to get more rights, more choices, more say in their own lives. We are the descendants, spiritual and sometimes literal, of these women. We live in a world that they could not have imagined, where women can own property, control their own money, refuse to obey men, live alone, have careers, choose not to have children. And we owe them something. We owe them the recognition that we are free because they survived. We are here because they endured. So the next time you take your safety for granted, or your right to choose, or your access to clean water or medicine or food, remember the women of London in 1640. Remember that these things that seem so basic to us were unimaginable luxuries to them. Remember that they lived, and they mattered, even if their names are forgotten. And recognize that there are still women in the world today who live under similar constraints, who face the same lack of choice, the same dangers, the same grinding poverty and lack of rights. History didn't end in 1640. The struggle continues, and our obligation to remember, to understand, and to fight for women's freedom and dignity, that obligation continues as well. This is the story of women in 1640s London. Not a romantic story, not a triumphant story, but a true story. And that, perhaps, is what makes it most worth telling.